Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Lindsay Brown, and I have the privilege of being the Director of the Client and Learner Experience team here at Melbourne Business School in the Executive Education function. And on behalf of the short course team, I would like to warmly welcome you to today's masterclass, Let's Name It to Tame It, Reframing Imposter Syndrome. I'm going to hand over to Jodie Evans, Associate Professor here at the school, and we'll get started.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks so much for coming this morning. It's often hard to make your way all the way to Carlton for an 8 a.m. but we will feed you afterwards. So there will be coffee afterwards. And I just want to begin by really welcoming you to where we are at the business school and acknowledging the history of the land that the school is on. That we know from research that the land the school is on, the land that the university is on, has been a place for centuries where elders and their forebears have come together as a place of celebration, of initiation, and of renewal. And they have sung and danced and talked their knowledge, their stories into this land. And I always think it's really appropriate that as a learning institution, we are in this place. And so I pay my respects and acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to any Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander people who are here today, and use this as an opportunity to invite you to continue talking your stories into this land and to really centre on place and how fortunate we are to come together on a place like this, and that we get to continue the world's oldest living culture and be part of that as we are here in Australia. So I wanted to start my talk today, and I'm a little bit concerned that it did resonate so strongly. We have a lot of people online. I wish that we had offered this talk and it had been an irrelevant topic. But no, this isn't me, this isn't relevant to me. But this is the third time I've done a talk like this in just the last few months. And so it does seem very pertinent to many of us. And so that's one of the first lessons for today, is that you are not alone in feeling like this. And there is so much power in having your experience validated by others. Because a lot of what we're going to talk about today with imposter syndrome is actually more your inner critic. And that thrives in isolation. And one of the best ways to quieten it is by sharing it and talking about it. And so I thought I would start today with a little bit about myself. Hello. This little girl would never have imagined this future for herself. Would certainly never have imagined becoming an academic or being at Melbourne Business School. And sometimes when I think about that critical voice in my head, it's that little girl and the way I was brought up, and that we were taught to be nice, right? Niceness was a big thing when I was little, and niceness often meant actually putting your needs after someone else's. And so now I kind of shifted. I'm like, I don't want to be nice anymore. I want to be kind. So I want to be thinking about other people, but not to the extent where I put myself last anymore, because I don't think anyone wins when we do that. And when I think about the journey I've been on that has brought me to MBS and why I've spent so long at the business school, and I reflect on my first experiences of being in rooms like this. So I interviewed for MBS when I was 27, and I was living and working in the UK. I didn't actually have any intention to come back to Australia at that time. But a professor who had been very supportive of me during my studies kept emailing me and encouraging me to apply for this job at Melbourne Business School. And I didn't even know what an MBA was. So I had not really heard of Melbourne Business School, and I didn't know what an MBA was. And he kept sort of pestering. And then he said to me, you know, if they decide to interview you, they'll fly you home. I was like, oh, okay, nothing to lose here then. So they did. They flew me out for a week. And MBS doesn't interview in a traditional way. So we tend to spend a lot of time with faculty candidates, and it's a lot of lunches, lots of dinners, lots of one-on-one meetings, and what we call a job talk, so a research seminar. And I had spent a few days at the school, and I had done what I'm sure many of you have done. I bought the suit, and I bought a super high pair of heels. Because I thought, I'm going to dress like a corporate, business school person dresses, and then I'm going to feel more confident. Right, so I'm going to armour up, if you like, with my clothing. And, I wore these crazy high heels for the week and talking to lots of faculty. And I would go home each day really confused because no one actually asked me anything about myself. Everyone kind of talked at me, told me about themselves, their research, how long they'd been at the school, but nobody actually seemed very curious about me, and it didn't feel like an interview. And then it came to doing the job talk. And I still have this enduring memory of just greyness when I was in that room. So grey suits, grey hair, and predominantly male. There was just maybe 2 women in the room that day and only about 4 women on faculty at that time. And I started to present, the nerves allowed. And I didn't get past my second slide before they, 2 of them, started yelling at each other. Oh. And so someone had raised their hand to ask a question, which was fine. But the professor who was running the recruitment started yelling at them and telling them that they couldn't ask questions and that they could only ask questions of clarification. And for God's sake, let me get through the presentation. And they just were yelling at each other. And I was just immediately kind of taken back. This felt very combative. It felt pretty aggressive. And I just immediately had all of those thoughts of, oh my God, I do not fit here. I have never taught MBA students. I'm not tough enough for this kind of dynamic. I'm too young, definitely felt young in that room. I'm not quantitative enough because they were all big quant researchers. And I'm definitely too female to be here. But despite all of that, I thought, well, I'm going to keep going. And so I continued with my presentation. I did get through it. But it is an enduring memory for me, that experience. And at the end of the week, as I was meeting with the head of faculty about whether they were going to make me an offer and whether I might be inclined to accept it, I had pretty much decided that I wasn't coming to Melbourne Business School, that this was not a place where I belonged. And I left his office and I was walking down, we have these very long corridors on the first floor. I was walking down this long corridor, doing that walk you do, because those heels, that blister, and by the end of that week, it was pretty much a monster. And that walk you do where you're kind of trying not to hobble and show anyone that you're in pain, but you really are? That was just all the way down that long corridor. And just before getting to the lifts, someone stepped out of their office. And it was one of the few female professors at the school at that time, Amanda Sinclair. And Amanda knew. She knew the school. She had been the first female member of faculty at the school starting back in the 80s. So she knew what the school was like at that time. And she just stopped me and she touched my arm and she must have seen it on my face. And she said, I'll just say one thing. If you don't come, nothing will change. And it was just, that inflection moment where she completely reframed the situation for me. Because up to that point, I had kept thinking, I don't belong. I don't look like them. I don't fit this profile of faculty at Melbourne Business School. And I was so inward focused. And she really helped just in that sentence reframe it for me. Oh no, it's about them. And so I hobbled back to the head of faculty's office and knocked back on his door to have a very different conversation. And I'm so grateful to Amanda for having seen me, really seen me, and for saying what she did, because I got to change how I thought about it. Less about what I didn't have and more about why did the school want me? What was it they were looking for? And it was a time of change for the school, and gratefully the school has changed significantly since that time. But I remind myself of that experience because it reaffirms to me that self-doubt, that's universal. But self-doubt isn't always about you not belonging. Sometimes it's actually a signal that the system needs to shift. And we've got to get better at separating those two things. What's happening in the system and our environment and what's happening within. And so I'm really grateful. It's 24 years now that I have been at the school, and it is constantly on a journey of change. And I'm thrilled that we now have female faculty in every single discipline group in the school, and that while we are still kind of 30% of faculty, we are quite loud 30% of faculty. And of course we have a female dean as well, which is the first time in the school's very long history.
So not me.
And so I share that story with you because we need to create a little bit more healthy distance for ourselves. And to know that self-doubt is natural and human. It is not a character flaw or a deficiency. And so my question to the room is really, and to those online, is how many of you have really felt those times where you didn't belong, or despite all evidence to the contrary, despite you getting the job or getting the deal or launching something successfully, you still think you're not good enough? Anyone where that feels? So welcome to humanity, because we all feel that way. We all feel discomfort, we all feel nerves. We all feel doubt about whether we've got it, whether we're enough. And we particularly feel this at times when we are stretching ourselves, at times when we are facing challenge, when we're doing new things. This is entirely normal. But only women really get this phrase of imposter syndrome put upon them. So it is a human experience, self-doubt, but imposter syndrome is a somewhat uniquely gendered language. And so imposter syndrome was actually originally called a phenomenon. It was identified back in the 70s by two female psychologists who were doing research actually on high potential women. And they were really interested in the fact that these high potential women who were leading in many aspects of life attributed their success to luck, and that they constantly felt somewhat fraudulent and like eventually someone's going to find out I don't really have it. And so it was initially just a phenomenon talking about high potential women. But then the concept grew and popular business press got hold of it. The media ran with it. Then there's so many books and podcasts and TED Talks which started to refer to it as a syndrome. And that's probably the biggest issue. Imposter-like feelings, universal. But the syndrome aspect of it, that is very, very gendered. And it started to pathologize something, which actually is just a normal human experience. And this is where the danger is, because it's become a catch-all, really, for just normal human feelings of self-doubt. But by making self-doubt a syndrome, by pathologizing it, we start to center the problem in women rather than in the causes of those feelings. So what is actually happening that is making us feel this way? And so this is why more and more discussion today, and I really like this point by Reshma Sajani. She founded Girls Who Code. She did a great speech at a commencement speech at a university in the US just 2 years ago. And she refers to imposter syndrome as a pure distraction. And she thinks it's a distraction that's being perpetuated so that we don't focus on the real problems and that we keep centering on ourselves. And so this is what I want to focus a little bit on this morning is naming and taming some of the systemic issues that might be driving these feelings. And so this is where we're going to shift the narrative. Taylor Swift is wrong. It is not you. You are not the problem, right? We want to start to balance self-awareness with awareness about systemic issues. And so some of those systemic issues really start around representation. And this applies to men and women. It's whenever you feel like you're the minority in that room. And there's a lot of pressure and issues that come with that lack of representation. When you walk into a room and you look around, you're like, nobody looks or acts or seems like me. No one has my background. No one talks like me. So this is kind of universal. Whenever you feel like the minority in that room, that can really engender a sense of a lack of safety for you. So maybe you find yourself censoring what you say a bit more. Maybe you talk a bit less than you would otherwise. You don't offer that idea up. There's less risk taking because the environment feels riskier. And all of that starts to feed that inner critic voice because you start to doubt yourself. The other aspect is we're paying a high emotional tax by being rare in a room. So there is an additional emotional burden as we try and fit in. Right? So we often talk about camouflaging behaviours and how do we do all of that work to fit in and build that kind of sense that we belong. And that's a lot of self-monitoring behaviour. So it's like this hyper-vigilant state. And that can just be very draining over time, but particularly draining of confidence. And then when you're rare, you start to question whether you have a right to be there. And you start to question, why am I here? Is it tokenism? Is it merit? Is it some other reason? And so you question it more, but also you find other people can question it more. The other aspect of this lack of representation is what we call the visibility paradox. So because you're rare in a room, so when I think about that room of greyness, when you're rare, it makes you more visible because we often highlight what's different. Think about spot the difference activities when you were a kid, right? We're often wired to spot the difference. And so on the one hand, we are more visible, which puts a lot more pressure. So we're under greater scrutiny. There can sometimes be this notion that we feel like we're representing our whole gender or our entire field or our entire race just by being that one person in the room. So on the one hand, we've got this intense pressure to perform and we're really visible. The paradox of this is that we can feel less visible when it comes to influence. That we might have a seat at the table, but we don't necessarily feel like we have a voice at the table. And this is where maybe our ideas aren't picked up by others. Or probably one of the biggest cues is we are more interrupted than our peers in the room. And so people talk over us, they take our ideas and run with it, and we get less credit as well for the things that we offer in a group dynamic. Also, sometimes we're left out of those informal discussions where often decisions are made. So decisions are often made outside of those rooms, but if you're not like everyone else, maybe you don't get invited to the football. Maybe conversation is happening actually in the bathroom and you're just the one not of that gender, so you're not in that room with them. And so this is where we get presence, but not necessarily influence. And so that's where underrepresentation is such a problem and why it's a big challenge when we're pursuing diversity in decision making. The other systemic issue is about the level of bias in feedback towards women. And I want to be clear that this isn't men doing this to women. This is men and women doing this to women. So we do it to our peers and to our colleagues. And I really like this quote from Cindy Gallop. It was in a Harvard Business Review piece in 2022, that women are critiqued so often that they're conditioned to be receptive to feedback, to take it seriously and personally, and to want to take it on board and do something about it. Now that's a great characteristic for a leader. You want a leader who's self-aware and who's seeking feedback. But the challenge is women are just getting a ton more of it, both positive and negative. So we just comment on women a lot more than we comment on men. But research also shows that high-performing women, so women who are doing well in their careers and in their jobs, receive substantially more feedback than their male peers. They receive more negative feedback, and what's most damaging is that they receive more personality-based feedback. You're too ambitious, assertive, loud, forceful. You need to be more confident, or at least sound more confident. You need to be more assertive. You need to be less emotional. You need to be warmer. You need to be less aggressive, but speak up more. But then say less. It is a torturous, torturous experience for women in leadership sometimes. And it becomes quite isolating because it drives this hypervigilance where you're just constantly conscious of how you're coming across. And that can really get in your way of just performing your job and getting stuff done. And so this type of feedback is particularly damaging because it's pretty vague and sometimes it's very inconsistent. So one person might tell you, oh, you were pretty aggressive in that meeting. But another person from the same meeting might tell you, oh, you did so well, you really stood up for yourself. And you just don't know who to believe. So you're getting inconsistent, vague feedback that isn't easy to action. It's often very style focused. So women get a lot of feedback on their pitch of their voice. Men never get that feedback. So there's also a lot of feedback that women get for doing things that men do, but they get a backlash from it. So you start to second guess yourself and it starts to undermine confidence. And what we find is it's not just doubt in our skills, it's identity-based doubt then. Because this is personal feedback about who you are and how you come across. And so that drives that inner critic. And this is what imposter syndrome is really referring to, right? That negative voice in your head, right? This inner critic gets louder and louder over time. And then when achievements do occur, and we find this a lot on our women in leadership programs, and I find this through all of my MBA classes, is the number of times women say, I was lucky. I was so lucky to get that job. I was lucky that person noticed me. And this attribution of achievements to luck, that's dangerous for self-confidence. And so this is where confidence just gets further and further eroded and making it really difficult then to trust yourself and to trust and have faith in your abilities and to be able to celebrate your achievements. And so let's look at what we can do about that. So one of the things that we talk about in our women in leadership programs and that we work through is how to quieten that inner critic. Because what we know is that critical voice, that thrives in silence and in isolation. So when you're at home and it's 2 a.m, that's when that critic is probably going to be its loudest. So what we want to do is get better at identifying that voice. And we do a lot of work in our programs on mindfulness. This is where mindfulness is a really great technique when you're experiencing high levels of self-doubt, is to be able to identify whose voice the critic is. So often it comes up that it's a parent, the parental voice in your head. It might be your childhood voice, it might be a teacher, but it's often someone actually who's been in your life. And that critical voice, being able to identify whose it is and where it's from, that's part of creating the distance. And then it's about acknowledging and telling yourself that it's not true. That this is someone else's opinion, this is that negative critical voice, but it's not truth. One of the things we work on, and it comes from a Buddhist quote used in meditation and mindfulness, is particularly when you're stuck in that cycle of rumination, so it's just running through your head, is to notice it and pause and acknowledge, hello, my old friend, I hear you again. And I have heard enough from you today. It's enough. So we want to start by identifying the critic, and then it's about creating that space. Just being able to identify it and separate it from truth. This is giving us an ability to create a bit of a boundary between our thoughts and our real sense of self and who we are. And then what we can do is we can flip that script. And the most important stories that we tell are the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And we need to get better at collecting powerful, positive stories about ourselves. And so it's about acknowledging what's the story you've been hearing too long about yourself or telling yourself for too long. And then often working with others. So working with peers and colleagues and friends who see you for who you are, to find truer stories that are grounded in evidence of who you are, how you show up, what you've achieved. And then being able to think through, well, if I believe that story to be true, what could I now do? What does this set me up to do and to build that sense of confidence? We're not talking about dismissing challenges with this, but we are talking about anchoring on self-belief that is based on our experiences and our achievements. And so this is where we do a lot of work at the school around helping you build strength-based narratives. So strength-based stories about yourself that are particularly powerful at times when you are facing adversity or where self-doubt is creeping in. We've got to be armed with those strength-based stories to sometimes counter all of the bruising that can happen as we're performing our jobs. And then there's this power of healthy reflection. So having a really healthy reflective practice, that's critical for leadership today. But what we want to do is we want to reflect without judgment. So we want to think about things, we want to acknowledge when stuff hasn't gone perfectly, and we want to acknowledge when we make mistakes, because nobody is perfect. But what we want to do is park the self-blame and judgment. And so healthy reflective prompts start with identifying in a situation, what is true? What do I think really happened here? What's my role in it and what else happened in this situation? What of my reflection is coming really from a place of fear? And even the feedback I might be receiving, is that true? Is that really about what happened, or is that personality-based feedback again? And what's the feedback that you actually want to keep and action as part of self-development and growth? Because what we're trying to do is separate out the growth opportunities from all of the other noise when we're reflecting. And I really believe that healthy reflection leaves you wiser about yourself, about the systems, about situations, and it should not make you feel smaller. There's enough in the systems that can sometimes make you feel quite small. We need to stop doing that to ourselves. So healthy reflection is really about creating some good boundaries there so that you come away more aware of yourself and the issues, that you have learnt and you're wiser, but you're parking that self-judgment. And then it's about the system. And this is about naming and taming systemic issues and not feeling like you're the only one who has to do this. And so this is where we want to recognise the signals. So we want to be able to think about when we're getting feedback or expectations or even just dynamics feel uneven. We want to name it. We want to be able to verbally acknowledge, and this is where it can really help if you write it down, what is actually going on here? And from this, naming the issue, this is where we're interrupting. We're interrupting all of the signal. And what we're able to do is reframe doubt as just data. This is information about a situation. And then we want to contextualize that experience. So this is where we need to talk to others. We need to do that sense checking. Is this just happening to me? Is this happening to others? Is this a pattern in our organisation? Is this a dynamic or a cultural issue that's coming up? And so talking to others to validate the experience is a really important way to reduce that sense of isolation. And then you get to respond with intention and not react. So this is about building confidence by feeling in control. Because sometimes what we do is we react in the moment. And we often walk away and it feeds our inner critic because we're then like, I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have done that. I wish I hadn't reacted. I sounded too defensive, and it all builds the cycle. So we want to be more intentional about how we respond to systemic issues. So we can think about, is this some challenge that I can address constructively, that I feel like I've got the power and the surety in myself to actually deal with this? Or is this something where actually I need support? I need to be gathering allies or finding sponsors who can really help deal with this issue. Maybe you don't have enough power in that room and you need to find people who do, who can help solve this. And it's also then about setting boundaries. How do you want to move on from this? Are there boundaries you want to assert? Are there adjustments that you want to ask for to be made? But it is about this intentionality and having paused before you respond. So we want to be responsive and not reactive is the goal. And this is about balance then. This is about balancing self-awareness with systemic awareness and identifying what we want to own and work on for ourselves and what aspects in the systems need to change. Because it's not always us, even though we might be pushed and made to feel like it is. But addressing systemic issues and change, that is hard to do alone. And so this is why it's also really important to build connections and to be seen. Because as I said, self-doubt thrives in isolation. And so this is where leadership, especially for women, can be a very lonely experience. You make it to the top and you want to be happy, but actually you feel more and more isolated from those who could be supporting you. And so this is where it's important to find those peer networks. So it might be in your organisation, it might be outside of it, but finding people that you can connect with who will support you. And it's also where there's value in things like leadership programs, because they help build that connection. What I often talk about with our programs is that we need to surround ourselves with more mirrors and fewer microscopes. So microscopes are designed kind of to look for flaws. And we need more mirrors sometimes when our self-doubt is loud, when that inner critic is particularly vocal. We need people who can act as that mirror for us to remind us of how we show up and the real presence and power that we have and our potential in all of this. So we need that positive affirmation, and we can't always do that for ourselves. We need to surround ourselves with people who can play that role for us. And that might be a sponsor, it might be a mentor, but it also just might be peers in your life. And so it's a lot of the reason why we developed the Women in Leadership programs at the school. So we started these back in 2016. So next year will be a decade of working on women in leadership specifically. And part of the motivation is recognising that there's amazing opportunities right now to lead in different ways, to redefine what leadership looks like for you and for it to feel more like you. So there's great opportunities, but also there's a tremendous amount of pressure. So we know that there's actually more expectation and pressure on female leaders to care about people's well-being. This creates extra burden on female leaders. We also know female leaders are more likely to be accused of bullying than male leaders when they're enacting things like performance management. So there's a lot of gender-based experiences that can make just practicing leadership harder. And so what we want to do is really give evidence and tools to help you succeed in your leadership practice. And I really like this quote from Jen Overbeck. Jen teaches power, influence, and negotiations on our programs. And when we've talked about, as a faculty team who work on this, what it is we think is different when we're teaching in these sorts of programs, it is about the nature of bringing people together. and that when facing real challenging conversations, you get to be an incredibly supportive and nurturing and safe place to talk about it. So the goal in our sort of programs, not just women in leadership, but I think actually the goal in most of the programs at the business school is really about building that sense of confidence again. Because we all have bruising experiences in leadership. And so how do we rebuild that sense of confidence? And often that comes from having a new set of capabilities to rely on. Because most of us are not trained for leadership. We kind of end up in leadership. I remember taking on an associate dean role. I suddenly had 15 professional staff reporting to me, and I had to do performance appraisals. No one had told me how to do this. How do you do really good quality performance appraisals and professional development conversations? So often it's when we're in new roles and we're faced with this discomfort, that's when we're looking for opportunities to upskill and to capability build. And a big part of leadership today is about maintaining curiosity. Healthy reflection actually comes from curiosity, not judgment. So how do we be more curious about ourselves and more curious about other people around us? And then the other aspect of our programs is very much about connection. Finding people who are going to be with you for life, who are going to be that support network for you, and where you get to reduce that sense of isolation. The goal then is to really help you thrive in leadership and find the joy in leading again. So if we can quieten that inner critic a bit, that creates space for joy. Leadership can be fun. It just doesn't always feel like that. And so our hope is that just from today, just telling you that you are not alone. What you are feeling is completely normal. You do not have imposter syndrome. It's not something you have. You experience transitory emotions of self-doubt and nerves. And we all can do a little bit of work practicing how to quieten that critical inner voice. And so now we'll open it up for questions, comments. So Lindsay, I'll let you manage what's online. Does this resonate? Do you feel better?
I'm happy to ask a question. Where does upbringing fit into all this influence?
Yeah. So upbringing is a big factor, right? So how you were talked to as a child, right? And that's why often when we do the work of identifying where that inner critic is, for some people that's a parental voice. So, and so there's also cultural aspects to it, that some cultures there's not as much praise. Other cultures maybe over-index on praise. But yes, if you're not praised early in life, it is hard to then have a positive story that you tell yourself, because sometimes you're just always wired for improvement. So some parents, some cultures, very wired to you must constantly improve, which means you never get to pause and consolidate the successes. And you then struggle to kind of claim credit for what it is you've achieved. So childhood, upbringing, culture, these are big factors. And just being able to identify them and talk it through, that can start to create some better boundaries for you and to find then new voices who are going to be far more affirming of what it is you bring and do. So yeah, great question.
Thank you. Very similar question. I struggle with the line between confidence and arrogance and celebrating myself too much versus not enough.
It is a weird cultural cringe, isn't it? You know, even the way people talk about LinkedIn posts now as a humble brag. It's like, where do you get to say, I'm proud of what I did? And we need to normalise that. So that comes down to role modelling from leadership, right? So this is the role of very senior leaders in organisations to reset that culture, because often it is hard to do it for yourself. And so this is where it's about the systems. What mechanisms do they provide for people to be acknowledged and to be able to celebrate? You know, you can build this into team agendas. We want to start every Monday meeting, so every kind of stand-up Monday meeting. What went well last week? What were you all proud of last week? So we can structure it into systems to make it easier for people to do this. Because otherwise, yeah, we're worried, right? We're vulnerable. If we celebrate something, will we be judged for it? And it is that constant fear of judgment from others that starts to become quite limiting.
I just want to say thank you. I'm very new to MBS this week, and it's been amazing just to be here and experience what you're all doing. So thank you firstly. But my question is around, you mentioned about gathering perspective as you sort of learn things, having self-awareness to make sure that there might be common themes and, is this something that everyone's experiencing? And my question is around, as you do that, how do you avoid toxicity where you could become sort of gossipy, where you say, oh, I've had a conversation with this person that seems to be quite negative, and so how do you avoid gossiping rather than actually gathering?
Well, and this isn't about talking to everyone about it, right? So this is, who are your most trusted peers? Whose opinion do you value? Who may have been in the situation or witnessed it? And then not sharing it beyond that, right? So this is sense making for you, not necessarily to then talk wider and further. So you're just gathering those few key pieces of information. And sometimes it can validate that actually this is a cultural thing. This is happening to everyone. Can be great power in that because you can get some collective action. But sometimes that context setting identifies, no, this is just happening to you, right? This is actually personal. And you're being treated in a way that other people aren't. And dynamics can develop. Unhealthy dynamics can develop. Leaders can develop closer bonds with some staff than others, and unfairness and inequity can grow. And it's okay to call that out, right? You can, and one of the things we do in our programs is talk about how to have difficult conversations, how to have a really clean structure of particularly calling out a senior leader about how they're treating you. Right? That's a hard conversation to have. Like, that's a place of deep vulnerability. And so what we talk about is being able to be very clear about describing the situation. So this is the situation that we were in. This is the behaviour I observed. This is what was said, or this was what was done. These were the words that we used. So this is the situation. This is the behaviour. So this is the evidence kind of part that you're giving. You're removing it from it being personal. It's not about them. It's about actions and behaviours you observed. And then it's being able to articulate the impact of that.
Yeah.
And maybe that impact is on you personally, but as a result of the way you're giving me feedback, and these are the words you used in your feedback about me, this is eroding my confidence. And that is impeding my ability to do my job. So situation, behaviour, impact, and then you can talk about change. So now that I've revealed this to you, I'd like to have a productive conversation about how we can change this. Right? So this giving structure, and that's a lot of what the school does, right, is often we are giving you structures and frameworks and tools for things that we are often doing instinctively. But once you've got a clear structure, it's so much easier to feel confident in those situations. So situation, behaviour, impact, change. So it's called the SBI model. And it is such a perk of running our Women in Leadership programs because I sit in on all of it. And so I sit in when Carol Gill teaches this, and every time I remind myself of how valuable. It's also a very good structure if you're a parent. Yeah. So it does work very successfully on teenagers, de-escalates emotions. But yeah, it's finding ways to feel more confident in those conversations. Other questions?
I think just building on that, Julie, firstly, thanks for being back here after so many years. I think reflecting my experience, there's obviously that part where you have that, inner critic saying that maybe you don't belong here, or you're not like them. But I guess there's also a fine balance of acknowledging that you tried your best, and maybe the environment is not the right one for you, and pulling back, or moving on, or finding another place is actually a better avenue because it's more damaging than actually.
And that's about that intentionality in your response. right? That's about really working through those systemic signals and what you're willing to accept. And sometimes helping surface, actually, I don't want to take this anymore. Tried to affect the system, we tried to be part of change, and it's not changing. So that then moves into, it's not me, it's them. And I can remove myself. We have the power to remove ourselves, right? And to not keep enabling unhealthy cultures or behaviours.
Which can be quite difficult sometimes because if you feel that you're pulling, you're moving on, you're like, maybe I'm a loser, I didn't try hard enough, or maybe I'm really not as good, but then actually it's the environment that is just too hard to change.
And that's where one of the best things you can do is be on the job market. So Marion Broadbent, who's a former colleague at MBS, and she teaches on our programs with us. Marion's in executive search and recruitment. And her advice to me was, it's very, very valuable to go on the job market when you don't need to. It's like, what are you talking about? Sounds exhausting. And she said, because it helps you know your worth. And you will discover that you have value that maybe your organisation isn't fully appreciating. Have a BATNA, right? So it is about recognising you've got options. Once you recognise you've got choice, that inner critic gets quieter, right? Because then you start to realise it's not me, I can leave this. And you're going to take yourself with you, right? So you're going to take yourself with you. What you leave behind is the stuff that didn't fit. And so that is about being intentional. But it can be also, and I acknowledge, very challenging if you are in an unhealthy organisational culture where confidence has been eroded, to pick yourself up to be on the market, right? To actively put yourself out there on the market. That's again where peer networks and support is so important. Being able to talk to people that you respect, maybe people you've worked with in the past, who can remind you who you are and what you bring. Because it is hard to do that when you're at your lowest point.
Jodie, there's a question from online from Fiona, who wants to know if you've got any pro tips for those of us who are mentoring women to identify and address this.
Yeah, so I have about 3 mentees at the moment. And one of the things I do with my mentees, and particularly there's one at the moment who's going through a really hard time. So very successful, achieved a lot, but in a bad dynamic, like in a really unhealthy dynamic with her line manager. And so it is about getting them to put it on paper. So often I say, if it's not written down, it's not real, right? There is a power in the act of writing things down. So getting and working with your mentees to write down what are they proud of from the last week. So sources of pride. Getting them to helping them workshop strength-based stories about themselves. Playing that role of sense maker is really important as a mentor, of helping them catch when they're talking about a situation, how much of it they say negatively about themselves versus actually naming those systemic issues. That's the value of having a mentor, so valuable, is because they are that mirror for you. Right, when you can't be it for yourself. So as a mentor, it's being very intentional with your own language. So really, really clear about the language you're going to use with your mentees when they are feeling most vulnerable or at their weakest, of what are the specific things you do to keep rebuilding and reaffirming strength. And helping them feel empowered when they do then identify systemic issues. And so meaningful tips around what can you do when facing these issues? Who can you talk to? Let's workshop, let's role play. Best thing I do as a mentor is being in that role play scenario. All right, let's pretend I'm your boss and let's practice this SBI framework, and you practice it. So yeah, mentoring is so valuable. Other questions?
So as a juniorish leader in the organisation, like, how can I best role model this for my staff? Because sometimes what I find, people might actually be observing me and, how I've acted in certain situations without me realising it. So I was like, oh, you did this and that made me feel like this. So is there a way that I can role model this?
And they are definitely observing you. Right, we all just need to accept that. As soon as you have a position of power or authority, people react differently to you. And in the past, you might have been able to make some off-the-cuff remarks and it'd be fine. Now, suddenly, every word is scrutinised. And they are listening in different ways. And this is where, as a leader, investing in trust building is a really important aspect of leadership practice. Right? So trust we think about is being made up of both competence and character. And often, if something's going wrong with someone and there's a bad dynamic, it's because an aspect of trust is missing. So we think about character, that's about intent and integrity. So they're looking for signs from you of good intent. So we're all meant to assume good intent today, but actually a lot of people don't assume it. So we have to be more overt about our intent. We need to verbalise our intent. Integrity is a little bit more about what we're doing when no one's watching, if you like. And so how do we show integrity in the way we behave? That comes down to the sort of stories we might share with our staff about, acknowledging when we've had to make hard decisions and how we've battled with the trade-offs. So really role modelling that difficulty in decision-making today, that can really boost people's sense that you act with integrity. And then competence is about your capabilities and results. So being able to talk more about the skills that you have, but a powerful role modelling act for leaders is to talk about the skills you are working on. Right? So role modelling to others that leadership is not a position, it is a practice, and you must keep practicing. So that's all about constantly investing in capability building, so talking more about that. And then sharing results, being proud when the team achieves something or when you achieve something. So let's say you're with the CFO and you're fighting for budget. You want to take that back to the team and really celebrate when you got some budget. Right? So role modelling is important as a leader, but we need to be better at verbalising. Don't assume that they know what is going on in our head, but they're judging you for everything you say and do. So you can use that. They're wired to listen to you. They want to hear what you're thinking and doing. So you can use that. And the more you're intentional about it, the more you get to feel good about your leadership and you get a really healthy dynamic. So I'm conscious we've got 5 minutes left.
Just a question around any kind of good tips on how to elicit feedback or how to, start a feedback conversation.
Yeah, so it's hard sometimes, right? Because people just do that thing, I think you're great, there's no problems. Right? What we want to find is what I call kind critics. Right? So finding people in our lives, either peers or more senior leaders, who will be a kind, constructive critic for us. I'm going to have this meeting coming up, you're going to be in it. I'd love to prime you before we're there, just for you to see how what I talk about lands. And I'd really appreciate it afterwards if we could have a debrief session. So again, it's about structuring it in. Right? So sometimes setting the situation up, but also there's this tendency for people to give a lot of unsolicited feedback. So it's always amazing when someone says, can I just give you some feedback on how that went? There is so much power in just being able to say, you know what, I would appreciate that, but not today.
Put it in an email.
Well, and often people don't follow up with an email, but it is about creating some boundaries for feedback of when it's okay. But if you're already beating yourself up, it is not the time. Like if you know the meeting didn't go well, you don't need anyone reaffirming that to you in that moment. So creating some healthy boundaries as well around when you're ready to receive feedback. And then it's about asking for a structured feedback. So this is where you can flip SBI and say, I would like feedback about situations you have seen me in and what sort of behaviour you think I have done well at and any areas where I can work on. And what do you think the impact would be if I change any of these things? You can ask for very structured, quality feedback, because often as leaders, we're also not trained in giving feedback. So I was running a session like this recently with a group of emergency physicians, and one of the men in the room was saying, you know, his whole job is to give feedback. So he's the one there with all the trainee doctors in the emergency room. And he had this epiphany moment in the workshop where he's like, I do tell them a lot about their tone of voice. I do tell them a lot that they need to be warmer. And these are junior female doctors who've been working a 12-hour shift. And they are trying to learn while also keep emergency patients alive. And the feedback they're getting in the moment is talk with more warmth. So he has gone away and structured a new way of giving feedback. So I feel like that one session with him in that room may benefit many, many doctors to come. Because we are not trained in giving good quality feedback. And so this is something we all need to work on. And to think about those people in our lives where we give them too much unsolicited feedback. Even when things have gone well, a woman is leading a meeting. She gets more unsolicited feedback afterwards. Oh, I really liked how you did that, or you did that so well, or, you know, I really loved how you argued this point. But when a man is doing a meeting and it goes well, he doesn't get any of that. It's just left. So it's also a problem for men as well that they don't get as much feedback. So it is harder for them to improve. And if you've already got a critical voice in your head, even for men, that inner critic can get loud. So we all need to own our role in feedback. Stop giving unsolicited feedback, whether positive or negative. Ask first, is this a good time? Would you like to have a chat later in the week? Or you know what? Maybe just recognise people don't always need to hear it. We can keep our thoughts to ourselves, it's okay. Other questions? We'll go here and then.
As a director, particularly with positive duties, what can be done at a governance level to address these systemic issues, particularly in relation to this phenomena, and ultimately, from an organisation's perspective, reduces engagement levels and organisational outcomes?
Yeah, I think the positive duty has changed so much for organisations, and it starts at the board. And so I sit on the board of the Melbourne Recital Centre, and we had training last year on what the changes in legislation around positive duty meant. And it shocked most of the room that it is no longer about addressing problems once they've happened. You must take responsibility for preventative actions. So it is elevating systemic issues and cultural issues into the boardroom now. So no longer can you separate that out as kind of more of an operational issue that's for management to deal with. The board has to start owning this. So this is about how it gets built into agenda items, how it makes it on the risk matrix. Because often if it's not on the risk matrix, it's not talked about at a governance level. So how do we put culture on the risk matrix? And how do we make that an agenda item at the board where we're looking for management to consistently report on it? What culture change actions are we taking? What role are we all playing with positive duty of care? But it has really elevated the conversation. It is a powerful impact of regulatory change.
What's your advice if you're transitioning from a leadership role in one company into another that's completely culturally different, a whole different area that you'll be working in with a new team, to set the scene for success as soon as you basically start in that new role?
I mean, it's such a fantastic opportunity, right? Because you get to start as you mean to continue. Like you get to be fully intentional versus when you're already in it, it's hard to fight back against reaction mode. So you get to be very intentional about how you want to show up and the impact that you want to have. And so I think the best thing to do when you are new in a culture is to start by listening. And a more important skill the older you get. Because the tendency is when you become more and more senior, you take up more airtime. You think your job is to talk more. It's not. It's to listen more, right? It's to play more of the sense-making work. So particularly when you're new and you want to be very intentional about your impact on others, we have a bigger impact on others when we are an active, present listener than when we are talking. And so if you want to think about your presence in that way, it's not always about being loud and super confident and really assertive in a meeting. Sometimes it's by deep, active listening, which then you get to gather data. You get more and more information about the situation you're in, and you get to then be really intentional. But also thinking about what stories you're going to tell about yourself in those first few weeks that showcase your intent, your integrity, your capabilities, and the results that you've been a part of. You can plan ahead for that. Such a great time. Any other questions? Thank you so much for making it into school at 8 a.m. For those of you online, I'm just so thrilled that we can do more of this work in hybrid mode and reach more of you. Please feel free to get in touch with me personally. So I'm on the MBS website. If you're experiencing any of these issues, I'm always happy to have a chat. And if you're interested in any of our programs, I'm always here to talk to. Sarah Faye is amazing to give you advice, and so is Lindsay. But thanks so much for joining us this morning, and we've really worked hard.
We've got some breakfast that we're serving in the dining room. Is there anyone who can stay?
Now is in the dining room. It's a great opportunity to build a new peer network, find some more support.
It's not a good start to the day. It's like hot. You're a tea drinker, not a coffee.
Which is like
We've come such a long way. But we still got so many things to do.
So you did that day to they put me in a trial class and I still
Oh, they did? Yes. Oh my
I didn't know
gosh.
how to compare because I was telling her like it took 5 years for me to student. And then when I said, oh, I want to try one class. And they really enjoy this class. They're smart.
I am often the one, so it's often the marketing classes that they put people in as a trial. Because they're not too threatening, and you know, we all have communication skills. So
I'm so good at feedback.
it's so nice to see you.
Yes. I think this is really relevant. I was initially thinking, oh, it's probably going to be, you know what, I don't know who else is coming, but it's like when you see the diversity.
It affects everyone.
It's a really good observation.
Yeah, I was thinking of that. Yes.
It's so different.
Changing.
I cannot put my hand up to say I'm an MBA.
But it's really,
Very, very.
I mean, the MBA is fantastic. Women in leadership, it's something special, right? Like the connections you still have.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
Everyone goes, I'm just maybe I'm not good. So I don't know if I'm good enough for this or. You know,
I'm going to the women in leadership.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm MCing.
Oh, yeah, okay, yes. I haven't been there for a few years, but.
Well, you've chosen the right one this year. But this year.
Like it.
Yeah.
Like it'll be
Alright.
really, the conversation
Take that on board, think about that.
having with the panelists
And which
and going back to kind of the notion that
It's the
conversation wouldn't be proud of anywhere else, that you might have seen even
There's the academic awards section. If you're doing your MBA or your master's, it's a second an executive education, which is more.
Yeah. Well, she's not at MBS anymore full time.
Short courses, and customised learning for organisations.
But this is the last thing she's going to do with me.
Many young
Yeah.
I really signed up, one of the, some volunteering with the just an FP
We empower everyone to get to that point. What were the 4 T's, the competency and capability, everything else? All those things.
Putting me in on her table.
To say
So yeah, glad to be back. I haven't been attending.
Well, come out and get some breakfast.
See, I was like,
the way that we sort of break it down is by industry focus.
That work online?
Yeah, it did. It was good. I got Alex just to change to higher education.
Focus on further.